he salido de la sesión. Un segundito. Is that New York traffic we are hearing? No?
That's my keyboard.
Ah, okay.
And probably some traffic too, because I'm by the window, so.
So I think we're going to wait 1 minute, see, because everybody else is still at lunch, they are coming. So please be patient a second. I'll see where they are. I'm sorry, I don't think you sent me your bio note.
Let me send it to you now.
Okay. Okay, so I will begin by introducing Paula Vilaplata de Miguel, who is many things. She is a curator at the MoMA Museum. She's a designer. She's a scholar based in New York. Her work focuses on exhibition spaces and cultural initiatives with an emphasis in media, technology, and bodily practices. She has been assistant director of exhibitions at Columbia University, GSAPP, and the Arthur Ross Architecture Gallery, a research assistant at Performa, and a lecturer at the New School Parsons. She currently works as a curatorial assistant for contemporary architecture at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, and has curated and developed projects for institutions such as the Shanghai Art Biennial, the Victorian Albert Museum, the Venice Architecture Biennial, Storefront for Art and Architecture, Princeton University, Triennale di Milano, and CA2M, among others. Her work has been published in the New York Review of Architecture, the Invisible Culture magazine at Rochester University, Arquin, and the Hat New Institute, and her projects have been featured in the press internationally. She recently developed the visual strategy for the 13th Shanghai Art Biennial and SPOR initiative in Berlin. Her research has been sponsored by the Temple Hoyne-Boole Center for the Study of American Architecture, Columbia University, the International Council of the Museum of Modern Art, and La Caixa Foundation, among others. And I don't think it says here that you're an artist as well, but you will see what I mean by that. So I am so glad to have you here with us, albeit virtually, and I think we are ready now to start. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amaya, for the introduction and the invitation to the conference. I am extremely honored and excited to be sharing this long-term research now with all of you. I will be playing a video, and please let me know if anything is not working. There should be sound after a few seconds. Haunted real estate. The room is grim. The last light of day shyly brightens the furniture of the seance. Bookcases, chintz curtains, a large sofa, and a record player. The sitters gather around a wooden table and hold hands. The seance usually starts with the Lord's Prayer. All electric lighting is turned off. Just a southward glow is permitted.
Excuse me, Paula. The screen is all green. It looks like it's frozen. Is it? No. Okay. Nothing's happening.
Okay. Let me.
Okay. Now we see a seance. Okay. Now you see you.
Let me try again.
So we did test this, and it did work.
It did.
There might be a delay, but it's odd because we do see you.
Yeah, let's try again. The room is grim. The last light of day shyly brightens the furniture.
No, it's gone again. Now it's all green. So we saw. Okay, now we see it again. I'm sorry. I don't want to interrupt all the time.
It's okay. No, we have to test it. Do you hear any sound from the video?
Yes, we do. Okay.
Okay. So perhaps we'll have to endure with a few glitches, but it looks like it comes back, no, to the.
Now it does.
To the school. Okay. Well, it's things of live presentations. Let me restart. I see it on the back, so I'll be looking whether there's a persistent green screen. Okay. The room is green. It shyly brightens the furniture of the parlor. Bookcases, chintz curtains, a large sofa, and a record player. The sitters gather around a wooden table and hold hands. The seance usually starts with the Lord's Prayer. All electric lighting is turned off. I see that, yeah, it's so weird.
It looks like it skips every now and then. It stops and then it jumps ahead. Do you think?
What if I share all my screen? Maybe that might help. instead of a window?
Instead of, yeah.
Okay, let me know if it doesn't work. The room is grim. The last light of day shyly brightens the furniture of the parlor. Bookcases, chintz curtains, a large sofa, and a record player. The sitters gather around the wooden table and hold hands. The seance usually starts with the Lord's Prayer. All electric lighting is turned off. Just a soft red glow is permitted. Is it working now?
Yes.
Okay. The only light suitable for spirits. Then the medium gradually falls into a trance. During the course of 3 hours, different phenomena take place intermittently. Lights flash, fluorescent messages are displayed in the air, along with rustlings, flower scents, abrupt temperature changes. At one point, the spirits ask for the lights to be turned on. Some of the sitters have been offered a floral crown. Then the lights go down again, and music starts coming out of the gramophone. The table tilts following the rhythm. In the dark, some feel caresses, kisses, or the touch of unearthly hands. Ultimately, if the conditions allow for it, the sitters witness the epitome of the spirit's manifestation, ectoplasm, extruded from the medium's body. The audience is puzzled. Every cabinet, piece of furniture, piece of clothing, even every orifice in the body of the medium had been thoroughly explored before the seance. Nothing in the room, an ordinary Victorian sitting room, seemed exceptional. Nothing but the presence of the medium herself.
I will try to achieve a trance state.
Between 1848 and the late 1920s, haunted houses spread throughout Europe and the US as a popular phenomenon. A mixed audience of believers, curious, skeptics, and investigators gathered in the domestic interior of the Victorian sitting room to witness the spectacle of spirits communication. Yet, these houses were not haunted per se. The presence of ghosts responded to the performance of the often female medium during a spiritualist seance. Such haunting was a spectacle that not only transformed the house into a public stage, but made it the core of a radical performance of political, social, and sexual claims. This first type of haunting differs from the familiar depiction of the haunted house presented through film, literature, and even historical landmarks which serve today as haunted attractions. The Victorian house is largely framed in film and literature as the quintessential architectural space for hauntings. Through its reiteration, these spaces, often haunted by female specters, equal danger for the viewer and play an essential role in building the atmospheres of films like Winchester, the house that ghosts built. Of a woman terrorized by a Victorian mansion serves as a recurrent promotional asset for films, novels, and even record covers. The promotional images and text for Winchester are especially telling. Inspired by true events, on an isolated stretch of land, 50 miles outside of San Francisco, sits the most haunted house in the world. Built by Sarah Winchester, Winchester Riffle Fortune, it's a house that knows no end. Constructed in an incessant 24-hour-a-day, 7 days a week, mania for decades, it stands 7 stories tall and contains hundreds of rooms. To the outsider, it looks like a monstrous monument to a disturbed women's madness. But Sarah is not building for herself. She is building a prison, asylum for hundreds of vengeful ghosts. Winchester, the house that ghosts built, is yet another cinematic iteration of the Winchester Mystery House, a 160-room Victorian Queen Anne-style extravaganza located in San Jose, California. Built between 1884 and 1922, it's popularly known as the Winchester Mystery House. The film's synopsis is very eloquent about the logics shaping what I will call the haunted house entertainment industrial complex. In barely 6 short sentences, Sarah Winchester is outlined as a disturbed maniac, a character-driven mad, her house a haunted, monstrous, and terrifying construction. The reason for such a dreadful plot is the presence of spirits transiting the mansion. The result is an archetypical horror story set among 19th century decor. The film's publicity images are equally revelatory. One shows the widow's mutilated face, her head split off by the house. On another, we read an ominous warning. Terror is building. Terror is indeed carefully built up in this and other locations, accommodated in the domestic interiors of Victorian historical landmarks reshaped as haunted attractions. This special form of entertainment today counts more than 2,000 houses listed in the US only, populated by an army of ghosts that solidifies the association between Victorian domestic architecture and the feminine channeling of spirits. The juxtaposition of Victorian dwellings and troubled women is indeed one of the few consistencies that one can find when comparing the historical and the fictional representations of the haunted house. While at the turn of the century, a house could be haunted mostly as the result of the work of a psychic medium, haunted houses appear today as permanent ghost residences, and their history is reduced to the threatening Victorian traits of their architecture. Before the Victorian house got haunted by an endless army of fictional spirits, it had been already bashed and inspected due to its suitability for the supernatural. To be more precise, the Victorian house had witnessed a targeted prosecution within its walls, the hunting of psychic mediums in their domestic interiors in the context of a radical and transgressive spiritualist awakening in the mid-18th. The same architectures that initially empowered and rendered the female medium visible would later condemn them, distorting a fascinating period in modern US history into a reductive horror plot, in which these female figures are continuously violated. How does this narrative shift? What triggered this transition between these two discordant representations of haunting? Spiritualisms emerged as a special form of Christianism that refused hierarchical power structures based on age or gender. It situated women as privileged ringmasters. Female bodies were perceived as ideal vessels for the spirits, making women entitled interlocutors with the other world. Starting wrappings in Hydesville in 1848, the US saw a rampant surge of female mediumship, counting more than 35,000 mediums after the Civil War. Such mediums transformed the Victorian house, an already female-dominated universe, into a subversive territory where to discuss topics often excluded from the public debate. These topics range from property rights for women to free love, voluntary motherhood, marital rape, or prostitution. Mediums delivered these speeches uncensored. It was not their voices on stage, but the ones of the spirits they channeled. The haunted house often so often appears as a threatening space in fiction, an image that contrasts with the accounts of 19th century sitters. Seance rooms were indeed highly controlled environments in which the communication with the dead developed as a collective celebration. Conducted by the psychic medium, the sitters enjoy the company of ghosts. These gentle interactions would appease any fear of the dead in a seance room perceived as a mild threat, a depiction that resonates with 18th century theory. Equally appeasing were the rituals and protocols of the spiritualist seance, much like a theatrical performance. The apex of the spectacle was the staging of material proof of the spirit world, a production that took various forms as spiritualist practices evolved from the Rochester wrappings to ectoplasms, an arcane spirit manifestation that would become the object of unscientific inquiries. In 1894, Charles Richet introduced the term ectoplasm to describe the projection of the substance, sometimes gauzy, viscous, or even vaporous, through the medium's orifices. Ectoplasms emerged as the ultimate evidence of the existence of the afterworld. They were visible and distinguishable from the body of the medium, although not completely independent from it. For the ectoplasm to be successfully delivered, the medium entered a safe space, the cabinet, in which she or he would fall into a trance, communion with the spirits. Under the pseudonym of Sam Refrickle, the magician, journalist, and psychic investigator Fulton Ausler, one of the most vocal anti-spiritualist crusaders along with magician Harry Houdini, described the spiritualist craze in his infamous exposé, Spirit Mediums Exposed, a compilation aiming to debunk. In his accounts, the magician described the conditions and apparatuses used by mediums and investigators during test seances, in which the psychics were subject to exam per part of the sitters. Among the props described and documented here, one emerges as key to understanding the way the Victorian seance room evolved at the turn of the century, and how it allowed for new spatial and social configuration. This space, this artifact, was the medium's cabinet. The cabinet started as an informal compartmentation of the seance room to create a private area for the reunion of the psychic and the spirit. It was formed by a curtain hung from the ceiling with ribbon in the middle for its access. The cabinet often contained an armchair for the medium and a red light for the spirit. It worked as a partition, producing a mise en abîme as it created a seance room inside the seance room. After the medium entered this device, she would fall into a trance and gradually expel the spirit through its and openings. The cabinet, the space from where the ectoplasm emerged, concentrated some of the traditional functions of a stage in terms of spectatorship and spatial configuration. The alleged candidness of the female medium was extended to her innocent cabinet. Both were under spirit control. Its domestic craft, it was often made of fabrics which were sewn by. Consider this device another dimension related to the female labor implied in its arrangement, standing as a technology that granted agency to its medium designer manufacturer. The medium would craft both the stage, the props, and eventually the spirit manifestations. The medium cabinet ghost ensemble was essential for the ectoplasm to be delivered. The emergence had two significant implications. On the one hand, it worked as an extension of the medium's body, a prosthetic implementation for the spirit delivery. On the other hand, the manufactured character of this furniture gave the medium excellent control over the conditions in which communication was established, as the medium administered the whole process in the sitting room. Spiritualist seances aspire to be scientific investigations developed under test conditions. The medium cabinet ghost ensemble would stand at the core of the discussion on the legitimation of the phenomena. This hybrid tool would also become the object of further inspections and redevelopments, and what at first emerged as an empowering mediumistic apparatus will progressively turn into a control. During the seance room, psychic mediums invited their sitters to become investigators and construct personal reports based on first-hand explorations.
Good evening.
My wife, Marjorie. Please. Marjorie, I'd like to introduce you to the famous Harry Houdini.
My dear, I hope so desperately that I can help you.
I'm more desperate than you are. If I could believe, if Mama could really... Look, I'm a magician. All my life I've used tricks, sleight of hand. What I'm trying to say is, I have to be sure you don't.
I have no tricks hidden under my robe, I can assure you.
They did not ask the sitters to believe,
Won't you take my word for that?
but to see and experience the psychic phenomena by themselves. Intimate accounts that had to do with their encounter with the medium's body operating as the interface with the spirit world. If the seance room was a laboratory, the medium's body was the object of study. Both were subject to close inspection. The examination of the medium's body added a sexualized component to the already sensual aura of the spectacle, allowed under the pretext of some. The presence of the medium cabinet ghost ensemble transformed the seance room into an experience that shared qualities of both a laboratory and a peep show, and the test seances allowed for physical interactions that surpassed the passive visual consumption of the spiritual spectacle. In the dark, aroused by the spirit's presence and the psychic's performance, the sitters experienced different levels of otherworldly encounters. What happened into the seance room was translated painstakingly out of its doors. Any conventional instruments failed to register the complexity of the phenomena. The investigators, often embarrassed, were forced to operate under conditions that mediums had stipulated. In the red glow of the seance, the photographic instruments failed again and again, and the facts had to be mediated through other channels such as audio recordings, drawings, textual accounts, or thumbprints, one of the few tangible pieces of evidence the spirits left on Earth. Ectoplasms represent a crucial moment in the history of spiritualism which, revisited today, enables us to categorize this movement as an artistic and technological avant-garde. Art historian Caitlin Kelly sees ectoplasms as symbolic creations, analogous to other artistic productions that as such implicitly carry cultural and aesthetic connotations. In turn, film scholar Karen Beckman inscribes ectoplasms in a prehistoric period of cinema and describes the spiritualist seance as a stage for the birth of film itself, a stage that transforms in conjunction with technologies of the time. Anne Delgado, a scholar in Victorian culture, will compare ectoplasms to film and emulsions that open windows to alternative worlds in a radical and transfigurative move. By contrast, Tony Ausler grants phantasmagorias, and other representations of the spirit world their own rubric in art history. Ausler distinguished phantasmagorias from the cinematic as an autonomous visual technology. In my view, the performance of ectoplasm did not just situate the body of the female medium as a proto-cinematic device, nor did it solely transform the Victorian seance room into a screening cabin. Rather, it produced haptic modes of vision and created an immersive experience that predated the codes and protocols of contemporary new media in terms of embodiment and if analyzed through the lenses of new media practices, the seance stands as a cabinet experience that experiments with media environments other than film and screens, in particular with alternative modes of vision. Displacements and embodiments were pivotal in the experience of the spiritualist seance, where the spirit manifested. The ectoplasm, in this particular case, stood as the interface that mediated communication between the medium projector and the seater's audience. The obscurity of the seance room under a red glow diffused the capacity of the eye to create sufficiently large images and clear, enabling technologies of vision that relate to other modes of perception, especially tactility and hearing. Under this atmosphere, the seaters held hands and maintained their feet in touch during the whole seance, each of them building a personal experience affected by their physical interactions. Accordingly, the accounts of these seances absorbed the seaters' physiological reactions to the spectacle, privileging their condition as witnesses over prospective descriptions. To apprehend the whole complexity of a phenomenon which by turn was mediated by another body, the one of the medium. Are you still watching the screen?
Yes. Sorry, I was sitting with the audience. Yes, we are seeing, this is a scene from Ghostbusters.
Perfect. Extruding ectoplasms from the interior of the cabinet, mediums revealed parcels of an unknown territory that some investigators expected to become a new science, plasmology. The medium transformed into a latent archive, storing a new mode of knowledge that she could activate through the ritual of trance. The performance culminated ecstatically with the resuscitation of the dead in the form of an uncanny document, the ectoplasm, occupying a liminal space between the material and the spiritual realms. Karen Beckman describes seances as spaces for discussing and speculating on alternative forms of knowledge, during which turn-of-the-century psychic mediums bypassed the limitations they experienced in the era. They did not only control the conditions under which the seance developed, but they also challenged the protocols of the scientific methods. In a similar line, art historian Zineb Selik Alexander traces relationships between occultism, gender, and design pedagogy, and sees occultism as a learning modality that confronted the hegemonic forms of culture and education. In my opinion, these assertions fall short, and it's through the insertion of the cabinet and the performance of the medium in the seance room that the process evolved from being a semi-public room to transforming into a learning space. The cabinet was a stage, a laboratory, a peep show, and mostly a sensual archive. The cabinet medium ghost ensemble, institutionalized in the context of the test seance, resulted in an architectural set of practices, including the design of the box of the medium's body and of the documents they produced. Ectoplasms themselves were architectural events in the sense that their production transformed the spatial conditions, materiality, and circulations in the seance room. The cabinet and the body of the medium were both producers and displayers of ectoplasms. As such, they could not only be researched but also redesigned. This redevelopment would result in a profound transformation of the protocols devices, and political stances of the seance, and would progressively diminish the medium's agency over the process. The events produced inside the seance room challenged the capacity of the scientific apparatus to offer a convincing repudiation of the spiritual phenomena, giving rise to a public debate on the limits of empirical knowledge. On the one side, the spiritualists saw in the Fox sisters the prophet of a new science, advocating for a sensorial, universalizing form of knowledge that educational and cultural barriers. On the opposite side, the magician Harry Houdini led an anti-spiritualist crusade that by turn questioned the capacity of the scientific knowledge to surmount the limits of human perceptual capacities, a gap that both spiritualists and magicians instrumentalized. In 1922, amidst a nationwide chiasma between advocates and opponents of spiritualism, the Scientific American Journal launched the ultimate provocation against this craze. The journal offered a $5,000 prize to any medium capable of presenting a satisfactory manifestation of psychical phenomena produced under test conditions. A multidisciplinary committee was in charge of examining the mediums. To assess the clever tricks performed by each candidate, the members of the committee developed a series of protocols and devices to validate their hypotheses. The seance room would progressively be redesigned to incorporate all the mechanisms necessary to exert strict control over mediums. On the pretext of a rigorous scientific investigation, the mediumistic cabinet, irregular, made of fabric sewed around an informal structure inside of which the medium could sit and move with ease, disappeared in favor of a new device whose aim was not to facilitate any spirit exchange, but to impede it: the medium box. Medium boxes were structures built in wood and later in steel and glass, designed to fit the medium's body and limit its movement. In this way, the informal fabric cabinet manufactured by the medium that once contained the magic of all ages ceded its place to rigid apparatuses to maintain the medium under anatomical, mechanical, and visual control. To sum up, surveillance apparatuses to deprive mediums of the easiness they previously enjoyed. After launching the contest, the Scientific American Committee managed to debunk some of the most prominent mediums of the time. However, when Nina Crandon's turn arrived, renamed Marjorie during the investigation to preserve her privacy, the committee faced an unexpected reverse. The protocols proved successful to expose other mediums did not prevent Marjorie from making objects levitate in the room or channel her spirit control. Even the voice of her deceased brother Walter manifested during the seances. The investigation concluded with no consistent results. The phenomena were ultimately attributed to a myriad of theories that ranged from hypnosis, automatism, unconscious fraud, to acrobatic dexterity. The process gave rise, however, to the construction of several extraordinary devices. Before the attempts to maintain Marjorie under absolute control during the total lapse of the seance, Houdini, whose efforts and campaigns to debunk mediumship would afford him a place within the Scientific American Committee, built a first device, the Margie box. This was a robust wooden cabinet that fixed the position of the medium to prevent her from using her extremities and simulate levitation. Houdini's designs relied on his expertise as an escapist artist. In that sense, the cabinet was a platform for the magician to showcase his proficiency as well as a propagandistic instrument. Houdini's career as a magician was partly built upon his ability to mimic mediums' tricks. He did not just confine the use of his apparatus to the privacy of the Harvard investigation, which by turn was confidential, but he exhibited himself in the box reproducing the tricks allegedly used by Marjorie in what Malcolm Bird described as a psychic vaudeville, highlighting the significance of this newly built apparatus as a performance stage. However, the apex of the Marjorie investigation took place at Emerson Hall's laboratory in Harvard University, hosted by a department that had previously developed experiments on perception, and which was transformed into a seance room for the Scientific American Prize. A total of 8 test seances took place here, taking the research to a high degree of sophistication and technological innovation to control the medium visually, mechanically, electrically, and physiologically. A special committee was designated, composed by members of the American and British Societies for Psychical Research, several Harvard experts on psychics and psychology, a lawyer, and Houdini. A series of medium debunking machines were built for the occasion. To identify the voice of Marjorie's spirit control, M.W. Richardson created the voice machine, a YouTube glass apparatus that controlled the movements of Marjorie's lips and tongue. The room was then electrified through a net of wires that activated an alarm in case of any sudden movement per part of the sitters. Marjorie was finally placed inside a high-tech cabin, a plate glass cabinet designed by Richardson as well, measuring 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 7 feet high. Its floor, though solid, was hinged at the back in order to be lifted and adequately inspected. The roof, also continuous, was screwed to the frame. Richardson disposed of eye bolts in different parts to control the medium's feet, besides securing her hands and ankles with a stiff wire. She was sitting on a Windsor chair. In front of her was a table. At her right, a megaphone. In the middle of the room, 5 wooden chairs formed a circle for the sitters. Outside the circle was placed a Victrola, next to which stood a phone, records, an illuminated watch, several seance apparatus like trumpets, a fluorescent donut, and a bell box, and a small red light. The picture of the room would be that of a woman inside an embryonic glass house surrounded by spiritualist domestic appliances. In the dark, luminous flashes, fluorescent objects in levitation, and electric wires composed a hyper-technological complex centered in the medium. A striking image at the time where electricity was still not commonplace in American households. Emerson Hall's haunted laboratory replicated the domestic environment of the seance, now refurbished with the latest technological developments, challenging the recurrent depiction of the haunted house as a regressive, obsolete scenario. On the contrary, this episode showcases the seance room as a high-tech environment that required the adaptation of cutting-edge technologies to monitor the evasive female body, and which resulting aesthetics forecasted a turn in architectural styles too. From the crafted textile cabin to the plate glass cage, the evolution of the medium's cabinet mirrors in certain aspects another operation taking place at the time, the transition from Victorian to modern architecture. Both participated in a process of rationalization and sanitation of the domestic space that would reformulate the circulation of bodies and information within the private sphere. This transition, in my view, was not alien to the eradication of female mediumship from the domestic realm. On the contrary, I believe that the devices and designs developed to eradicate mediumship can be seen as early experiments that would later impact architectural developments and the design of other forms of control of female bodies within the domestic realm. In the context of early spiritualism, the seance room stands as a hybrid space between a performance stage, a laboratory, and a delivery room. Performing in the dark under a red glow, Tom Gunning describes the medium as an uncanny photomat, dispensing images from its orifices. Karen Beckman, by contrast, compares the production of ectoplasm to a birthing scene, with the medium painfully delivering the spirit assisted by male physicians. This image is reinforced if we consider that both skeptics and spiritualist supporters would relate mediumship to the womb. Ectoplasms not only conveyed the defunct, but they were also themselves crafted from dead tissue and could hardly be detached from the medium's body without vanishing again. The battle for women's rights that was partially delivered in a trance state and the production of ectoplasm was, I would argue, closer to the staging of an abortion than a birth. Through the means of this performance, turn-of-the-century psychic mediums elaborate of claims about labor, reproductive rights, and the construction of knowledge. We can trace a parallel chronology between spiritualism and reproductive rights and find women progressively losing agency in the late 19th century. Both women and their associated domestic spaces transitioned from a leadership status to a position in which they became suspects. The disempowering presence of the female mediumship increased attention to her entourage, and the house, perceived as a territory in danger, became the center of the debate. The shielding of the house implied the close supervision of what had accesses to and what circulated within it, the bodies that occupied it, and the practices allowed within its walls. The 19th century also saw a paradigm change regarding the birthing process, no longer captured as natural but as a potentially pathologic scenario carrier of disease and infections. As a result, midwives were replaced by male physicians, terminating a long tradition of female networks of care in favor of the nascent modern science. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle pointed to the womb as the medium's power source, a recurrent assumption of female reproductive capacity with the supernatural, not necessarily as a positive feature. Indeed, mediumistic uterine productions were deemed repulsive, horrible, revolting, and viscous substances, at least in the words of Houdini. Similarly, in 1874, the neurologist Frederick Marvin described a syndrome relating spiritualism to a uterine disorder. He called it mediomania. Quote, "The angle at which the womb is suspended in the pelvis frequently settles the whole question of sanity or insanity. Tilt the organ a little forward. Introvert it, and immediately the patient forsakes her home and embraces some strong ultraism. Mormonism, mesmerism, Fourierism, socialism, oftener spiritualism." End quote. According to Marvin, the female relationship to the house in the spiritualist milieu was pathological, a hypothesis that classified these women as ill subjects, disabled bodies suffering from a uterine deformity and therefore incapable of performing any relevant task or occupying a public position. First, the psychic medium would be deemed pathological, then the spaces she inhabited. What was haunted turned out to be infected, an association that would pervade even architectural discourse, as illustrated in this 1918 Lysol's advertising campaign, which compared ghosts to germs. How to banish the ghost, they asked. The vilification of the Victorian became commonplace in architecture texts. Louis Montfort described architecture as a visible manifestation of systemic disease and rot. Talbot Hamblin described it as wooden monstrosities. Later, Sherwood Bessel would cite them as vile excrescences. Finally, Guy Pen Dubois certified the death of Victorian architecture. These dead American houses, he said, whimsical exaggerations in tortured wood, are haunted.
Fear visits many places, but this is where it lives.
The convoluted and inefficient Victorian house seemed to be as tortured as its tenants, transferring symptoms to each other. It's not surprising that, in this context, the psychic investigator Malcolm Bird described Mina Crandon's house in Lime Street as the perfect haunted house. He said, "It possesses an complexity largely due to extensive remodeling, which surpasses belief. There are 2 flights of backstairs, affording 4 independent points of access to the front of the house. The whole house fairly teems with curious closets, crannies, cubbyholes, large and small, blind shaftways, the utility or necessity of which is not always apparent. Could one look for a better haunted house?" Previous scholarship on haunted houses often attributed physiognomic qualities to such architectures. The house exudes repressed traumas in Sarah Burnet's Better for Hounds, or reflects a moral distortion in Spiros Papapetro's Malicious Houses. Nevertheless, neither of them seems to connect these spaces to a 70-year history of the haunting of the Victorian domestic sphere through spiritualist practices, a movement that the New York Times estimates as having 11 million followers by 1874. What motivates such an omission? Just as if the haunted could be expelled through structural reform, modern architecture emerged as an antithesis of the Victorian. It was clean, pure, and free from suspicious spirits. The continuous assimilation of the haunted, and by extension of the Victorian, as sick, when paralleled to the regression of reproductive rights in the period, makes us see the rising of the modern style as an ultimate enforcer of the vicious female governance of the house. The glass plate cabinet to surveil the medium will expand into a whole glass house. Turn of the century spiritualism saw an opportunity to appropriate an effervescent moment in science, technology, and politics. Only inserted women in the economy as labor, but also reformulated their role as central agents of these transformations. Moreover, the alternative views they proposed on technology, politics, and social relationships generated a genuinely innovative universe that would set the ground for further dissident practices, an influence that can be tracked in visual arts and performance, but also in feminist and... This revolution took place while women were in a trance, most of the time within their private homes. The Victorian house, being the center of operations of the spiritualist practice, was progressively inspected, regulated, and ultimately reconceptualized. Let's not forget that spiritualism and the practice of mediumship is banned still to our day in New York. Extending the discussion to the my work aims to dismantle the tropes binding female specters to the Victorian house, inspecting the discourses and mechanisms favoring this association to discuss what the modern refusal of the Victorian implied at large. Ultimately, my use of the term real estate underscores the description of haunted houses as products of a broader market economy. Following Silvia Federici, Following Silvia Federici's rewriting of witch hunting, now parallel to the rising of capitalism, it seems crucial to frame haunted houses not only as cultural artifacts, but to also attend their economic dimension and to read them as political games that draw a calculated narrative regarding the inclusion of women in labor and property structures. The case of turn-of-the-century psychic mediums is critical in the way it inserts mediums in the economy as labor and reformulates their role as central agents of social and political transformation. The reaction against these women required the setting up of a multimedia apparatus in law, science, and technology with a massive media campaign. Most of the products of such reaction, from ordinances to advertisements, novels, or films, including haunted attractions, persist to our day, naturalized as part of the entertainment industry. Architecture plays indeed a key role by sharing its expertise, assisting and refining the process through formal implementations, and finally, seeding its remains, historical Victorian landmarks, to serve as shells for its final product, the haunted house, allegedly conceived for entertainment purposes only. Thank you.
Well, I am in awe of you. That was simply amazing. I think every single time I had a question popping up in my head, you would immediately answer. I mean, I was thinking of Adrian Rich's A Woman Born, and you mentioned the reclaiming of the space of the cabinet and the redesigning of the whole experience to have it under control by all of these, I'm assuming they were all men, male scientists, male experts from Harvard and members of committees. That was really quite a haunting image, I have to say. So thank you very much indeed. And now, if there are any questions, comments, I'm sure no questions, no comments. Well, I have a question. We are running very late, but I'm just going to ask you a very quick question. Did you say that it is legal in New York to be a medium?
Yeah, it's illegal in many parts of the US, and this dates back to the late 19th century, early 20th century. There was a huge trial against several psychics, and it has been illegal to perform mediumship and to basically take money from psychic practices since then.
Oh, okay, so it is actually considered such an issue that there is a law against it. Okay, very, very interesting. I'm afraid we don't have time for more, but thank you very much for being here. Thank you for this amazing presentation, and well, that's all, right?
Invitation.
So now, our last panel.
dropped off. Do you have a presentation?
Yeah, I'm going to use my laptop.
Okay.
Yeah. Guess. Yes.
Just in case I was just saying something interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's here. Wait. It's here, yes.
It's a beautiful one.
Thank you. I think I'm ready.
Yeah, something like. Okay, so whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Okay, good afternoon. You can hear me, I guess. I'm going to introduce to our next presenter, Dr. Edmund Ankoma.
No, I'm not doctor yet.
Not yet.
Yes.
Sorry, I just got carried on. He's a fifth-year PhD candidate in Literary and Cultural Studies at Illinois State University. Originally from Ghana, Mr. Ankoma earned his bachelor's and master of philosophy degrees in English literature from the University of Ghana. His research interests include science fiction generally, Afrofuturism, African futurism, other non-Western sci-fi, with a particular preoccupation with alienness, extraterrestriality, and how these intersect with issues of race and postcoloniality. He is currently working on a dissertation that explores figurations of extraterrestriality in Afro and African futurist texts. When he is not immersed in science fiction research work, he enjoys playing video games and watching science fiction TV shows and movies. Mr. Ankoma lives in the United States with his family. And the title of his talk is We Do Not Come in Peace, Rethinking Alien Bodies and Encounters. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Does this work? Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. So this work is it's actually a chapter in my dissertation, and my dissertation is titled "Fabulating the Alien: Black Speculative Fiction and Rereading of the Xenological Archive." And so, what I would attempt to do today is just share with you some of the thoughts from that dissertation that I'm almost done with. So this is like a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about African futurism vis-a-vis Afrofuturism, even though my preoccupation here today is to just talk about African futurism. I'm going to talk about xenocorporeality. It's a category that I am theorizing and I'm developing, and also xenospace. And I'm looking specifically at Nnedi Okorafor. Nnedi Okorafor is a Nigerian-American novelist who is essentially associated with African futurism, that genre that we refer to as African futurism. And I'm going to talk about these interesting characters and then the conclusion. All right, I'll get right into it. These are sort of book titles by Nnedi Okorafor, and I'm going to show you Nnedi Okorafor in a bit. But essentially what African futurism is a cultural aesthetic that combines science fiction, African history, African culture, and is specifically on and about African people. So there is a very African investment, a very African epistemology in that particular sense. I don't know how many of you know any of these authors, but these are interesting ones. I'm just going to talk about LaGuardia. And to do that, let me just share with you just a quick video, and I'm going to try to rush through this as quick as I can. So this is, hopefully you can see. Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay, so this is Inedio Okorafor's LaGuardia. It is a graphic novel. It is based on her own experience going through the TSA in, I don't know if any of you have been to LaGuardia Airport, but it's a reading of alienness and immigration and how these are kind of interlinked. Binti is another interesting one. It's a trilogy, and it's essentially about this African girl, actually from Kenya, who goes to university in an intergalactic sort of university called UMZA University. And a number of things happen, but basically the spaceship that she's on is attacked by a jellyfish-like alien species, and a number of things happen. But yes, I'm just going to move on. So African futurism is a sort of, like I mentioned, a speculative genre, and these are some of the authors who I believe have influenced just the genre of speculation. So one of them is Amos Tutuola, and the other is Dio Fagunwa. I'm just going to talk about Amos Tutuola a bit. Now, he imagines, in the Palm Wine Drinkard, he imagines a world where I don't know how many of you know what palm wine is. Palm wine is a kind of fermented local alcoholic beverage, right, in parts of Africa. And so what happens in this story is this person who loves palm wine, his palm wine tapster, the person who makes his palm wine, dies. And he's so frustrated by this death of the palm wine tapster and goes on a search to bring the palm wine tapster back to earth. And the way it is framed, the way the story is imagined, it's sort of like taking the train from Vitoria Gasteiz to, I don't know, Miranda or something. So kind of like going to the world of the dead is kind of like taking a train to another space, to another place, right? And so that's one of the things that I actually talk about. In African futurism, this idea of the unseen world as this other space that is not kind of connected to the seen space that we live in is kind of challenged, right? The unseen and the seen are always already sort of involved. And so this is Inedio Okorafor, and she essentially explains that African futurism is a distinct genre from Afrofuturism. And I don't know if I mentioned it. Today I'm not talking about Afrofuturism specifically, but in my dissertation I talk about Afrofuturism as well. For those of you who've read or who've seen texts like Jordan Peele, for instance, Get Out, Us, Nope, these are Afrofuturist texts. Victor Laval is another one, Tanana Narif Dew, Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy. I talk about all of these things in my dissertation. But the point is that Afrofuturism is more specifically about African-American sci-fi and African-American experience, the lived experience of being African-American. And so you'd find that in a lot of Afrofuturism, there's a very racial investment or race, kind of investment with racism and how racism works within the North American space. I can share with you one Afrofuturist text. I don't know how many of you have read Derek Bell's The Space Traders, but it essentially imagines a world where aliens arrive in the United States, and they arrive with a kind of curious proposition, right? And this is the proposal. They are prepared to help America, to save America. And so the aliens arrive at a time where America is in crisis, right? And the aliens are prepared to help America, save America, if only they are allowed to, if only they are willing to give them all their African Americans, all their black people, right? And so America has to vote. Do you want African Americans to stay, or do you want them to go with the space aliens? And I'm not going to tell you what happens, but yes, it's definitely something that you want to think about. But African futurism specifically is sci-fi, and that is not just from Africa or set in Africa, but it is about Africa. And I'm sure some of you have watched Black Panther, right? So Black Panther is set in, particularly an American space. So we have Oakland, California, whereas in African futurism, the setting will be an African space. So you can have Nigeria, you can have Ghana, where I'm from, Ivory Coast, Kenya, that sort of thing. So one of the things that is important in the region of African futurism, like I mentioned, because it centers African values or African ways of knowing, right, which is what we refer to as cosmology, you would find that there is a very religious kind of African traditional religious investment in there. Now, this is a quote from one of the foremost African religious philosophers called John S. Mbiti. And he says that, quote, "The spiritual world of African peoples is very densely populated with spiritual beings, spirits, and the living dead. To understand their religious ethos and philosophical perception, it is essential to consider their concepts of the spiritual world in addition to concepts of God. We have repeatedly emphasized that the spiritual universe is a unit with the physical, and that these two intermingle and dovetail into each other." And so I'm just going to stop with this. So the idea is that the unseen and the seen are always already involved. All right. So this is the category that I was talking about, xenocorporeality and xenospace. And I'm just going to share with you how I'm defining xenocorporeality as a category. So what is the alien body? What are its textures? How does the relational and sort of oppositional rubrics with which we trace, map, and create the alien make apparent particular ideologies, right? So for those who have been following sci-fi's most beloved trope, which is the alien, right? You'd realize that in a lot of sci-fi depictions of the alien is this aggressor. Typically the alien is an aggressor. The alien is monstrified, if you'd like, right? The archetypal villain. And so xenocorporeality intends to trace this kind of relational and oppositional rubric. So on one level, it functions as an aesthetic, a way of imagining the alien body. On another, the xenocorporeal might be deployed as a critical category to interpret, critique, and theorize the ideological contours of the alien. So you realize that in all of this, one of the things that is apparent is difference, right? Difference and otherness, and how discourse operates in the making of the alien. One of the things that I also argue in my dissertation is, on one level, the alien does not exist, but on another, it actually exists, right? But we can talk about that later. This is, so in the world of Lagoon, which is the novel that I'm talking about, one of the beings that exist in that world is a figure called Mami Water. Now, Mami Water literally translates into mother water, kind of like a sea goddess or a sea creature. And I know a lot of you are thinking about the mermaid, which is another conversation that we can have, and how the Euro-Western depiction of the mermaid comes or compares with this figure of Mami Water. But Mami Water essentially is worshipped in parts of Benin, basically in parts of West Africa. But in other parts, Mami Water is also seen as a kind of malevolent being, right? But the interesting thing about Mami Water is that she's not one thing or the other. She's just she's just a being that exists and could very well be malevolent, could also be benevolent as well. So these are just depictions of Mami Wata and what that looks like. So let me talk a bit about the novel, just to give you a bit of context. And I'm trying not to read, just to give you a sense of everything that I'm talking about. So this is the cover art of Lagoon. Now, typically, when aliens arrive in any space, you would find them kind of, so a spaceship arrives in the air, they kind of drop down, do all of what they want. But in Lagoon, there's a subversion of the typical alien that arrives from the skies, right? So the aliens that arrive in Nigeria, the aliens that arrive in Lagos are actually amphibious, right? They arrive from the seas. They don't arrive from the skies. So the kind of subversion of this Euro-Western sci-fi imagining of the alien as always coming from the skies, a spaceship appears. In the aliens that are imagined in this African space, which is Nigeria or Lagos, the aliens arrive from the sea. So they're kind of aquatic or amphibious in some ways. There's also a post-colonial kind of colonial rhetoric that underlies this reading of the sea, which we can talk about later as well. All right, so one of the divine beings that are imagined in Nnedi Okorafor's Lagoon is a character called Ijele. Ijele is an embodiment of ancestral spirits, right, called the masquerade. So the masquerade is a kind of physical depiction of, Ijele, and Ijele is the chief masquerade. There are other kinds of masquerades or ancestral spirits, and these are ancestral spirits that connect the unseen world to the seen world, right? And there are all sorts of festivals around this particular being. I'm just going to read or share with you the encounter with Ijele when we first meet Ijele in the novel. Give me a second here. Let me find it and share with you. So this is where I read from the novel. Give me a second. Okay, I'm trying to find it. Sorry. But anyway, so what happens in the novel is that when Ijele appears, there's a kind of general anxiety and fear that occasions Ijele's arrival, right? So there's this idea of Ijele as monstrous in some ways, but that's particularly fine because Ijele, in the visual depiction of Ijele, is a 30-foot being, right? And you cannot gaze upon Ijele. People believe that if you gaze upon Ijele, you will die. So Ijele is a creature that is, or a being that is feared. And in the novel, Nnedi Okorafor brings in Ijele along with the other extraterrestrials that actually exist in this particular space. The other creature that is imagined in Nnedi Okorafor's Lagoon is Eshu Elegbara. Eshu Elegbara is an Orisha, and I'll just explain. Now, Orishas are divine beings. They are particularly found with the Yoruba people in parts of Benin, Nigeria, not in Ghana, Benin, Nigeria, and the Ivory Coast, right? So the Yoruba people it's kind of like a pantheon, right? What you have as Greek gods, if you like, or from Norse mythology, and how Norse mythology has their own sort of divine beings. But some people have argued that the Orishas are not actually gods or deities. They are kind of like angels, if you'd like. So that's what Orishas are, and there are several of them. Some of you might know Shango. Shango is kind of the Yoruba equivalent of Thor in Norse mythology, right? And it basically looks like Thor. And I don't know what the connections are between Norse mythology and Yoruba, but that's certainly something that is interesting. So yes, Elegbara is another character that is imagined. Again, Elegbara is neither malevolent or benevolent, but he's essentially seen as the god of the crossroads and can be a trickster. There are other fearsome depictions of Elishu Elegbara as well. The other character that is imagined in the story is Udide Okwanka, also referred to as the Great Spider. We have versions of the Great Spider in basically just across Western African mythology. And usually the Udide Okwanka is also imagined as a trickster being in some ways, right? I don't know how many of you have read Stephen King's It, maybe even the movie adaptation of Stephen King's It, right? So Pennywise the Clown, one of the things that we know about Pennywise the Clown and the lore around Pennywise the Clown is that Pennywise the Clown is extraterrestrial, and one of the forms that Pennywise the Clown likes to take is the figure of the spider. So it's kind of interesting readings of the spider in that particular sense. Now, in the story Lagoon, the story is told from Udide Okwanke's perspective. So there's a non-human figure that tells the story, that tells us everything that happens in Nnedi Okorafor's Lagoon. Now, one of the things that happens in Nnedi Okorafor's Lagoon that I want to talk about is because they arrive from the seas, what they do is that they transform the biotic sea life, right? And so in the opening scene, there's an octopus that is missing one tentacle, and the aliens go, to the octopus, and they transform the octopus into this giant kaiju. For those who know Godzilla, right, a kind of kaiju-like creature, and becomes a kind of sea monster. And the reason they do that, actually one of the reasons they do that, if you know anything about Nigeria, Nigeria is Africa's major exporter of crude oil. And so what you would find is that there's a lot of pollution in Nigeria's sea life in general. And so when the aliens transform the sea life into these, massive creatures, they attack the oil ships, right? And they drive them away from the waters, and they clean the water, right? What happens at the end of the text is that we have Nigeria's waters that are clean, safe from pollution, and all sorts of interesting aquatic creatures that emerge based on the alien arrival in that particular space. The other interesting figure, other alien figure in the text is the bone collector or the road monster. I particularly like, Nnedi Okorafor's reading of the bone collector. Now, again, the point I'm making with my reading of this, the xenocorporeal, is that the alien is not just the planetary being that comes from outer space, right? The alien in Okorafor's imaginary is every non-human being, right, that exists with and relates with the world that we see. And all right, so this is the first time we meet the bone collector. I'm just going to very quickly read, and so this is an excerpt from the novel. In that moment, I understood in my gut she was not human. So this she is one of the aliens, right? And I don't know if I mentioned this already, but the aliens in Lagoon are shapeshifters. And I'm sure the shapeshifting trope is one that we are all familiar with for those who follow alien sci-fi. She was not earthly, she was something completely other, right? She was not evil either. The road was undulating, then it began to stretch like hot plastic. Something beneath it groaned, deep and cavernous. The air stank of tar, and I felt a blast of heat on my face. The road said as it began to move beneath the vehicles. My nostrils stunk from the stench. The road was rising up in a huge snake-like slab of concrete, the faded yellow stripes still in view. Then it rippled into a concrete wave. It knocked cars off itself as it rolled toward the fleeing people. When it got to them, well, you heard nothing but shrieks of agony. The road said. Essentially, this is a road that eats people, right? That eats people. And so this is, the last thing I'm going to say. In Nnedi Okorafor's Lagoon, what you find is a reading of the alien, a kind of expanded reading of the alien that draws in mythical religious creatures, or what we might refer to as divine beings. And they exist in the same diegetic life world with extraterrestrial beings, right? And they actually interact. So what you'd find is that we have ghosts, right? We have ghosts that coexist with actual extraterrestrials. We have other creatures that come alive when the aliens actually arrive within Lagos's life world. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. Now we invite Agate to join us, please. Okay, Agate is our next speaker, and I have her bio note in Spanish, so I will be reading it, right? Agate Amilivia Caray nace en Amorebieta, Vizcaya, en 1994 y comienza sus estudios musicales a los 6 años de edad. A los 9 años se traslada a recibir clases de violonchelo con Elena Escalza en Bilbao, y es en este periodo donde consigue varios premios en el concurso de jóvenes músicos de Euskadi y queda 2 veces finalista en el concurso nacional de violonchelo Jaime Dobato Benavente. A la edad de 17 años se traslada al Conservatorio Superior del País Vasco, Mosikene, donde finaliza los estudios superiores en 2016. Realiza el posgrado orquestal de la Universidad de Santiago de Compostela en la Escuela de Altos Estudios Musicals, EAM, en el curso 2016-2017. En junio de 2017 toca de solista acompañada por la RFG, Real Filarmónica de Galicia. Ha sido miembro de la JONDE, Joven Orquesta Nacional de España, desde el 2015 al 2019. También ha colaborado con orquestas sinfónicas profesionales como la OSE, Orquesta Sinfónica de Euskadi, y la RFG. Ha colaborado como profesora de violonchelo en proyectos de diversos países como Venezuela, Colombia, Honduras o Chile. ¿En inglés o en castellano vas a hablar? Y el título de su presentación es In the Music of Ainur, an Interpretation. Va a probar que funciona y comenzamos.
Vale, está enchufado, ¿no?
Igual cuando me des a preguntar. Ahora, ya lo tienes.
Vale, buenas tardes. Gracias por la presentación. Bueno, yo os vengo a hablar del Ainulindale, que el Ainulindale es el primer capítulo del libro del Silmarillion de Tolkien. No sé si lo conocéis, pero vengo a hablar un poquito de este capítulo. El Ainulindale está en idioma Quenya, que es el idioma de los elfos, pero en nuestro idioma, en español, se diría la música de los Ainur, significa. Y en este capítulo, Tolkien nos relata de dónde viene toda la creación de su legendarium. Entonces, es el mito de la creación dentro del mundo ficticio inventado por Tolkien. ¿Qué pasa en este capítulo? Que la creación de Tolkien no se puede entender sin la música, puesto que es la música la que crea la vida, el universo, todo lo que tiene relación con Tolkien. Entonces, lo primero que quiero decir es que yo no soy una estudiosa del escritor, sí soy una gran amante y soy músico. Entonces, lo que he hecho con este capítulo ha sido una interpretación musical personal. Puesto que Tolkien describe muy claramente la música que va a ser la creadora de este mundo, y entonces yo le he dado una forma un poco más tangible a esa música. Decir que es una visión también personal y propia y que cada uno lo puede interpretar de diversas maneras, pero bueno, yo lo he hecho de esta manera. También es muy interesante decir que da unas descripciones musicales bastante concretas, teniendo en cuenta que él con la música no tenía mucho que ver. Pero, bueno, un apunte interesante sería saber que su mujer sí era pianista, entonces seguramente ahí habría una gran influencia en el escritor. Antes de empezar, me gustaría dar un contexto de qué va este capítulo, porque pues, habrá que saber de qué trata para ver la música por dónde viene. Entonces, este capítulo se basa en el principio de la creación. En el principio está Eru en un vacío, no hay nada. Y Eru se supone que es un dios, o es el dios creador de este universo. De sus pensamientos nacen los que se llaman los Ainur, que podríamos llamarlos para nosotros como unos semidioses o así. Hay muchísimos de ellos y Eru, el dios creador, les propone un tema de música. Y los Ainur también hay que decir que son una especie de dioses que cada uno tiene una función especial, como por ejemplo pues tenemos el Ainu del agua, el Ainu de las estrellas, de la tierra y las cosas que crecen. Son diversos y hay de todo un poco. Entonces, ellos, cada uno entiende esa parte que le corresponde de la mente del dios creador. Y hay uno de los Ainur que va a ser el antagonista en toda la historia de la Tierra Media, que es Melkor, que lo que le ocurre desde un principio, desde la creación, es que va ya en contra de lo que están haciendo el resto de los Ainur. Tiene sus propios pensamientos y los traslada a esa música creadora y de ahí surge todo este problema. Un pequeño apunte antes de empezar, me gustaría hablar sobre el concepto de la llama imperecedera, que es un poder divino, misterioso, místico que posee Eru, que es lo que le da el poder de crear vida. Entonces es Eru el que lo posee. Y bueno, la música esta se divide en una pequeña introducción y 3 grandes partes, podríamos decir. Vale, de lo que os voy a hablar un poco va a ser, primero voy a hablar sobre unos pequeños datos musicales para poder entender de dónde va la cosa. Luego lo que voy a hacer es explicar unos fragmentos de la música relacionados con el texto y luego ya una escucha completa de la pieza, que son unos 5 minutos o así. Vale. Entonces, los datos musicales que he utilizado para esta pieza y por qué los he escogido. Lo primero, la escala en la que he compuesto esta pieza es la escala de do mixolidio con la cuarta aumentada. Y ahora, ¿qué es esto? Bueno, la escala en sí es lo que le va a dar color a la pieza y se basa en todas estas notas que están arriba. La que he elegido es la de do, entonces empieza en do. Entonces el do va a ser el centro tonal constantemente. Mixolidio significa que es una escala modal y las escalas modales son antiguas, son de la antigua Grecia, entonces lo que le va a dar es un color antiguo. Y como la música es primitiva porque es creadora, pues he elegido una escala modal. Y la cuarta aumentada, que no forma parte de la escala de do mixolidio, sería el fa sostenido, que es la cuarta nota que aparece ahí, que tiene el sostenido, está alterado, y esa va a ser la forma musical de representar la llama imperecedera, que es una decisión mía personal, no tiene nada de musical. Y para acabar, el acorde que aparece ahí abajo es el acorde de do disminuido de séptima, y es el acorde con el que va a atacar siempre Melkor, el antagonista de esta historia, que es también de do, basándose en el mismo centro tonal, pero es mucho más discordante y disonante. Y ya dicho esto, ya empiezo con la música. Entonces, el libro lo cuenta así. Empieza la historia con Dios Eru, también llamado Ilúvatar, en un vacío, en el que con sus pensamientos crea a los Ainur y les propone temas de música. Al principio los Ainur están un poco perdidos, entonces la música es un poco plana, llana, no va a muchas partes. La verdad es que es simplemente de encuentro entre ellos. Lo que os pongo en la presentación es exactamente textual del libro. Entonces yo lo he propuesto así en mi pieza. He puesto a cada nota uno de los dioses y lo interpreto así. La primera nota que aparece sería el do, que es representación de Eru en la música, sería el dios que está constantemente ahí. Y se van añadiendo las notas. Y, por ejemplo, la segunda nota que se añade, que sería el mi, que está puesto ahí, sería el dios Ulmo, que es el del agua. Y es el único que va a estar fluctuando, representando las olas del agua. Luego tendríamos la nota más aguda, que representa a los dioses Manwe y Barda, que son los Ainur de las estrellas y de los cielos. Luego tenemos el do de abajo, que sería Yavanna, que es la de la tierra y de las cosas que crecen. Y el do más grave representa a Aule, que es un guiño porque es el creador de los enanos y los enanos viven bajo tierra. Esto no lo vamos a escuchar ahora porque es 1 minuto y medio de introducción. Eso directamente cuando lo ponga entero. Entonces, ahora ya empieza la música y estamos en la primera parte. Consta de 3 partes después de la introducción. Y en esta primera parte ya empiezan a crear ese tema. Entonces, esto es una introducción a ese tema, que suena así. esta introducción daría pie ya al tema principal que se va a estar repitiendo constantemente en estas tres grandes partes. Y el tema principal, la primera vez que aparece, sería un poquito relajado, no muy desarrollado, sencillo, porque es la primera vez que aparece, que es cuando ellos empiezan ya a crear este universo. Continuando con este capítulo, nos comenta, después de unos pequeños episodios armónicos que, bueno, luego los escucharemos, la primera intervención que hace Melkor, el antagonista en esta historia, con su do disminuido. Y es que es este momento en el que empieza a tener sus propios pensamientos y los traslada a la música, y entonces empiezan a crearse las primeras discordancias, como lo dice ahí Tolkien. La primera intervención es muy corta y es directamente cortada por Eru, Ilúvatar, el dios, y entonces entramos en la segunda parte de esta música. Y entonces comenta que este tema es nuevo, sin embargo es parecido y distinto al anterior, y cobra fuerzas y tiene una nueva belleza. Entonces sería el mismo tema, pero mucho más desarrollado y con mucha más presencia. Y entonces, en esta segunda parte, otra vez, Melkor, nuestro antagonista, vuelve a intervenir y vuelve a interrumpir la música que están haciendo los demás Ainur. Y no contento con solo una vez, que es muy parecida a la primera vez que lo hace, insiste. Esta vez desarrolla mucho más su material y además, por lo que nos dice el escritor, hace una pequeña lucha con Manwë, que sería, en el pensamiento de Eru Ilúvatar, sería su hermano. Al final, ¿qué ocurre? Que en esta lucha el que gana es Melkor y Manwë se calla. Aquí es cuando Eru levanta la mano y lo vuelve a parar. Y esta segunda parte se acaba aquí. Y se presenta el tercer tema dentro de esta música. Y entonces es cuando dice que brota un tercer tema, y es distinto porque al principio es dulce y suave y literalmente dice un mero murmullo de sonidos leves en delicadas melodías. Entonces, ¿cómo he interpretado yo esto? Porque no puedo poner el mismo tema una y otra vez, aunque él describe que básicamente es el mismo tema y una y otra vez, pero está un poco variado. Entonces, en este aspecto le he querido dar un rollo, vamos a decir, de olas, de agua, porque es un mero murmullo de sonidos leves. Y es mantener la misma armonía, pero cambiando lo que viene siendo el tema principal. Y en esta tercera parte vuelve a aparecer el mismo tema, pero dice que adquirió poder y profundidad. Por lo tanto, le he metido más instrumentación y le he cambiado la armonía para que no suene redundante constantemente. Entonces, suena parecido, pero suena diferente y suena más profundo porque hay más instrumentos con muchos más graves. Y bueno, ahora llega para mí el momento más interesante de esta parte del relato. Aquí me tengo que detener un poquito, porque en la mitad del relato cuenta Tolkien que Eru, Ilúvatar, es directo creador de vida, y entonces ese es el que crea elfos y hombres dentro de la mitología de Tolkien, y lo hace sin que los Ainur lo sepan, es algo que lo hace por su cuenta. Entonces, he cogido un episodio musical en el que se relata esa creación de los elfos y de los hombres. ¿Cómo? A ver, esto igual va a ser muy técnico, ¿eh? A ver, el arpa, ¿se ve ahí? Ah, bueno, donde pone ARP, es el arpa, el instrumento, y hace 4 notas, mi bemol, si bemol y do bemol. Lo que he hecho ha sido, a cada nota de la escala, le he asignado una letra, y el resultante de Eru, de ERU, han sido esas 3 notas. Entonces, este motivo literalmente significa Eru, 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 muchas veces. Entonces, eso es una representación de Eru trabajando en su propósito. Y después tenemos primero en las flautas la entrada, que son los elfos, porque son los primeros nacidos, entonces entran primero, y después tenemos a los hombres en los oboes, que son los segundos nacidos, entran más tarde. Y he elegido esos intervalos, la distancia de las notas, porque el motivo de Eru está compuesto por una quinta y una segunda. Entonces, los elfos hacen una segunda y los oboes hacen una quinta. Los hombres hacen una quinta. Y este motivo se repite 3 veces cambiando la armonía, dándole un poco más de tensión al tema, y suena así. Pero no hay nada que odie más Melkor que la creación de Eru, que son los primeros y los segundos nacidos. Entonces, su tercera intervención en esta tercera parte de la música es abrupta y, como dice en el libro literalmente, dice: la música era estridente, vana, infinitamente repetida y poco armónica. Y dice que toca pocas notas y todas al unísono. Es muy abrupto porque quiere cortar de raíz eso, esa creación. Entonces, esto sonaría así, el final de la tercera parte. Y se queda colgado porque en ese momento ya Ilúvatar, o Eru, Dios, se pone de pie, se enfada y corta toda esta música con un acorde más profundo que el abismo, según Tolkien. Y a partir de ahí la música cesa. Entonces, así es como sonaría ese acorde que interrumpe toda la música. Y ya viene el final de la música, que es, después de todo este proceso de creación, Ilúvatar, Eru, les dice: contemplad vuestra música, y les mostró una escena dándoles vista donde antes había habido solo oído. Los Ainur vieron un nuevo mundo hecho visible para ellos y era un globo en el vacío. Y entonces es cuando Eru dice: ea, que sean estas cosas, y enviaré al vacío la llama imperecedera y el mundo será. Y estos son los 2 últimos acordes que terminan con esta música. El primero es el acorde de fa sostenido mayor, que es el que representa la llama imperecedera que da vida. Y el último sería el acorde de do mayor, que es el del ser. Es el centro tonal de toda esta pieza de creación. Y suenan así. Ahí va. No, así no. Vale, y esto es un pequeño desgranaje de todo lo que está dentro de la pieza para tener unas nociones un poquito básicas de lo que está pasando, porque si no, simplemente es música. Y ahora me gustaría ponéroslo entero de arriba abajo. He preparado un vídeo dura 5 minutos y el vídeo da unas pequeñas explicaciones también para que no nos perdamos dentro de la música. Y bueno, esto ha sido todo. Espero que os haya gustado. Ay, bueno.
Muchas gracias, Agate, por
Nada.
esta presentación tan ilustrativa y tan bonita, la verdad.
Gracias.
Hasta yo la he podido seguir, vamos. Muy interesante. Well, now I do not know if I have to speak in English, Spanish, both. So if you have any questions or any comments that you want to make, you're more than welcome to. Amaya has got one.
So, first off, thank you very much. I mean, two very different presentations, but I have learned so much from both. I have first a question for Edmund. So, I was intrigued by these Ceno creatures from the lagoon, these submarine creatures, because they reminded me in their alienness and the fact that they don't come from outer space. I was thinking of The Shadow over Innsmouth by Lovecraft, although in Lovecraftian mythology, eventually all creatures come from outer space. All the gods and deities and different monsters, somehow, most of them come from outer space. But Cthulhu, as we all know, sleeps and perhaps dreams at the bottom of the ocean, but it's definitely a presence in all of these submarine creatures that are hybrids and live in this very secluded community in this imaginary New England, are not nice. They are portrayed and constructed as other in the most abominable sense of the word. And I would just like clarification as to the relationship between the non-human creatures and the human creatures in these entirely different versions of version of Ceno-human relationships.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So, again, because these creatures are very, related to a particular African epistemology, right? The idea is that, and we have variants of them, right? So how the southeastern Igbo people of Anambra State would imagine Mami Water, for instance, as a benevolent being would be different from how those in the north part of that territory would imagine that particular creature. So there are different ways of relating with and imagining these creatures. But then what is particularly striking in these imaginings is that they are not one thing, right? They are not this kind of default archetypal villain, that only do evil, right? And I think this goes back to I think the earlier presentation in the morning that was talking about monsters, right? And how we moralize, we kind of read these creatures from a kind of human moral lens, that they have to be binary coded, like they are either evil or they are good, right? So we kind of read these creatures from that particular binary moral, But they are different. It's an interesting question because there are different readings of Mami Water. If you think about Mami Water from a particularly Christian perspective, for instance, right? Mami Water is evil. There's nothing redemptive about that, a creature that comes from, from the seas, right? That creature is evil. There's nothing redemptive about that creature. And so from a particularly Christian lens in Africa, that, those creatures are evil, right? They are not from God. And actually in the novel, that comes through, right? Because there's a religious figurehead called Father Oke, who when he comes, actually for Father Oke, even aliens, extraplanetary beings, which is an interesting reading, even though they are from the skies, they are not of God, or they are not from God in that particular sense. So it's a kind of interesting reading of that, yes.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. And I also have a question for Agate. Should I, te lo digo en castellano?
Sí.
Vale. Igual es una pregunta muy tonta, pero me ha llamado la atención que en la construcción todos los personajes, yo en mi, lo poco que sé, música, ritmo, melodía. Vale, que me ha dado la sensación, igual no lo he entendido bien, pero que los instrumentos, que los personajes, que tal, eran todos líneas melódicas, o lo que yo entendería por melodía, y ninguno era ritmo, o lo he entendido mal, o no, es una pregunta tonta.
Sí, no. Cada uno tiene su papel, pero algunos son más melódicos y otros son más rítmicos.
¿Y cuáles serían los rítmicos entonces?
El rítmico ha sido el Melkor, el antagonista.
Vale,
sí.
ahí va yo.
He jugado un poco también con melodía y ritmo para diferenciarlos muy claramente.
Vale, es
sí.
que cuando se oye el
Sí.
y tal, digo, uy, y entonces me preguntaba, ¿eso es porque lo has decidido tú?
Sí,
¿O ya hay
sí.
una tradición de un poquito cuando hay que darle el tono malo a algo, se juega con el ritmo más que con la melodía?
Bueno, también se utiliza mucho así, pero puedes decidir hacer todo lo contrario.
Vale.
Depende de lo que está el oído acostumbrado, pero sí es intencional.
Vale.
Es sobre todo para diferenciar las dos partes y que no queden parecidas, porque si no, no se diferencia muy bien dónde está el bien y dónde está el mal.
Vale, o sea, es que la
Sí.
pregunta que acabo de hacerle a Edmund era sobre, al final, hablado de binarismo
Sí.
y tal, digo, pues
Sí.
mira, bueno, al final un poquito Tolkien sí que binariza, ¿no? Vale.
Sí.
Pues muchas gracias.
De nada.
Any more questions? No? There's one more question there.
Hi, thank you both for your presentations. I found them both very, very interesting. I have a question for Edmund, because you mentioned that in the novel, the perspective is from the non-human, well, the aliens that come from the sea. So I was wondering how will I ask this? How much of the narrative, this narrative decision, contributes to creating this or subverting what has been done with the essentialist alien stereotype in Western science fiction, for instance? How much of that is contributed by the narrative voice being given?
I think that's, thank you for your question. I think that it's interesting that the story is told from the perspective of a non-human creature, like the Udide Okwanka, the storyteller, right? But also in African folklore, the story or the narrative is usually presented or given to humans from or by a non-human creature. It's either God or some kind of deity, and so the story is passed to us from the world that we do not see or that we do not interact with. But I think that more to your question, I would say that it's particularly effective in that sense that the story is being told from a non-human being that is asking us to rethink, well, on some level, just the default rendering of the alien as aggressor, right? Or that non-human beings are evil in some ways, right? Which also goes back to the question of filtering non-human beings from a human perspective or from a human lens. So yes, I think that, I'm actually going to think about that in my dissertation as well. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Any other question or comment? I think we need to leave.
Yeah.
because-
No, okay. It's okay. Yeah, I just, okay, now we finished the program, the conference today. I will remember you that tomorrow we will see each other in the Faculty of Arts, 9 o'clock. Now we have some more activities related to Tartalo. Now we have the presentation of 2 books in Alcar campus. We are going to go now together, most of us. The Space Alien as a multitude in Latinx science fiction, written by our colleague who is here today, Dr. Matthew David Godwin. And the second one will be Contos de Isla de Man, written also by by Dr. Milagros Torrado, who is here as well with us. After that, we will have also another talk about constructions in Japanese settings. Then we will have board role as well in Valinor society. So many more activities. Very quick in Spanish, and we leave. Bien, pues acabamos aquí la sesión y ahora pues tenemos más acciones relacionadas con Tártalo. Tenemos la presentación de 2 libros, que ya he dicho los títulos. Tenemos también una charla sobre arquitectura y luego también habrá pues, las sesiones de rol de mesa en Valinor. Y hay una charla bastante interesante con autores vascos que escriben en euskera, que también será en Montehermoso y esa es a las 8 de la tarde. El título es Fantasiasko Euskal Herria o algo así, no sé, no me acuerdo muy bien la literatura. Si es que lo tengo que ir mirando porque ya ni me acuerdo, son tantas cosas, pero bueno, a las 8 en Montehermoso. Así que estéis todas y todos invitados a las diferentes acciones. Gracias y nos vemos mañana.